Stand on Bursa Hill in Tunis today, and you are standing on a crime scene. Below you, quiet suburbs. A lagoon. The blue Mediterranean. Almost nothing tells you that this was once one of the richest cities in the ancient world. A city of tall houses and crowded harbors, whose trade routes stretched from Africa deep into the Atlantic West. Rome did not just defeat this city. Rome erased it, fought through its streets for 6 days, burned its buildings, tore down its walls, sold the survivors into slavery. And when it was over, the story of Carthage was left almost entirely in the hands of foreign and often hostile writers. For more than 2,000 years, we have known this city mainly through the words of its enemies. This is the story of the rival Rome never forgot. According to an ancient tradition, it begins with refugees fleeing a murder in Tyre. Chapter 1. The Fugitive Queen. Before there was Carthage, there was Phoenicia. And before you can understand Carthage, you have to understand what kind of people the Phoenicians were, because they were unlike anyone else in their world. Picture the eastern coast of the Mediterranean around 1000 BC. The narrow strip of land we now call Lebanon. Behind it, mountains covered in cedar forests. In front of it, open sea. The people of cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos had little farmland and no room to expand. So they turned their backs on the land and made the sea their country. While the great empires of the age measured power in soldiers and territory, the Phoenicians measured it in cargo. They were among the finest sailors, shipbuilders, and traders alive. They carried cedar wood to Egypt, copper from Cyprus, silver from Spain. They perfected a purple dye made from crushed sea snails, a color so costly that for centuries afterward, purple meant royalty, and along the way they helped spread something that changed history more than any battle, an alphabetic system of about 22 letters, more compact and, for many practical uses, easier to learn than the great scribal systems of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The Greeks adopted it and added vowels. The Romans took it from the Greeks. The letters on your screen right now are distant descendants of that Phoenician system, whose children would eventually be written across much of Europe and far beyond. Here is a strange fact worth pausing on. We remember Rome for its legions and Greece for its philosophers. The Phoenicians helped carry writing across the ancient Mediterranean, and most people cannot name a single one of them. That silence is not entirely an accident. The Phoenicians produced records and books, but their longer writings are almost completely lost. Thousands of their short inscriptions survive, on stones and coins and offerings. The histories do not. What we know of these people comes mostly from Greek and Roman authors, their rivals and eventual conquerors. Keep that in mind whenever this story sounds one-sided. Much of it was written by one side. The greatest of the Phoenician cities was Tyre, an island fortress just off the coast, so wealthy that the Hebrew prophet Ezekiel described it as a ship loaded with the treasures of the whole world. And it is in Tyre, in the second half of the 9th century BC, that the story of Carthage begins. According to the tradition passed down by ancient writers, it begins with a family, a fortune, and a knife. The king of Tyre died and left 2 heirs, his son Pygmalion and his daughter Elissa, a woman later authors would call Dido. Elissa was married to her uncle Acabas, the high priest of the god Melkart, and reportedly the richest man in the city. Pygmalion wanted that wealth. So, the story goes, he had Acabas murdered, expecting his sister to be easy to control afterward. He misjudged her completely. Elissa pretended to accept her brother's authority. She announced she would move her household, and her late husband's treasure into the royal palace. Pygmalion sent ships and men to help carry the gold. At sea, Elissa ordered sacks thrown overboard, telling her brother's men that this was the treasure, offered to the sea and to her husband's spirit. The sacks were full of sand. The real gold was still on board. Now, she told the king's men. They had a choice: return to Pygmalion and explain how they had watched his fortune sink, or sail with her into exile. They chose exile. A group of Tyrian nobles joined her with their own ships, and the small fleet turned west. A word of honesty here, because this channel does not blur the line between evidence and legend. This account comes from later Greek and Roman writers. Above all, Timaeus of Sicily and Justin, who was summarizing an earlier Roman historian named Pompeius Trogus. They wrote centuries after the events, and no Carthaginian version survives to check against. The famous romance between Dido and the Trojan hero Aeneas is even less historical. That was perfected by the Roman poet Virgil, and the timeline does not work, since Troy fell some 4 centuries before Carthage was founded. So treat Elissa the way historians do. Possibly a real founder, certainly a founding myth, and one of the few stories about Carthage where the city gets to be the hero. What is not myth is this: the traditional founding date, 814 BC, appears again and again in ancient sources, and modern archaeology, digging through the earliest layers of the city, has found material from the late 9th and early 8th centuries BC. Legend and evidence fall within roughly the same window. Something real began on that shore, close to the time the old stories claim. The place the settlers chose was a peninsula on the coast of North Africa, in modern Tunisia, and you could hardly design a better site for a trading power. It sat at the narrow waist of the Mediterranean, where the sea pinches to less than 100 miles between Africa and Sicily. Ships moving between the eastern and western seas passed nearby. It had defensible high ground, sheltered anchorages, fertile land, fresh water. The settlers called it Carthage, which in their language meant simply new city. Greek tongues bent that into Carchedon. Roman tongue bent it into Carthago. Carthage. One more legend clings to the founding, and it is too revealing to skip. The local Libyan ruler, the story says, agreed to sell the newcomers only as much land as could be covered by a single ox hide. Elissa accepted. Then she had the hide cut into one continuous, hair-thin strip, stretched it in a great arc, and claimed the entire hill within it. That hill became the citadel of Bursa, the same ground you can stand on today. True or not, the tale shows how the ancient world saw Carthaginians, people who would honor the letter of a deal while outsmarting everyone in the room. Clever, literate, commercial, and to their enemies, never quite to be trusted. Remember that stereotype. Centuries later, Rome will make full use of it. The story of Elissa herself ends in fire. According to the tradition, a neighboring African king demanded her hand in marriage, threatening war against the young colony if she refused. Trapped between destroying her city and betraying her husband's memory, she ordered a great pyre built and threw herself into the flames. Her people honored her afterward as something close to a goddess. Whether or not it happened, hold on to that image. A Carthaginian woman choosing fire over submission. At the very end of this story, the image will return. The refugees had their city. Over the next 3 centuries, that huddle of exiles on a foreign shore would grow into something their homeland never became. Not just a port, a great power, but a power built on an unusual idea of what strength was. Not land first, not conquest first. Water, ships, and money. That power is where we go next. Chapter 2. The Empire of Salt Water. Somewhere off the coast of Spain, on a grey morning more than 2,000 years ago, a heavy merchant ship is running before the wind. Her hold is packed with silver. Behind her, a foreign vessel is following, keeping just close enough to watch her course. The story goes that her captain understood exactly what that meant. The stranger was not hunting his cargo. He was hunting his route. So the captain drove his own ship onto the shallows and wrecked her, cargo and all, rather than let a rival learn the way to the silver coasts. When he made it home, the story says, the state repaid his losses from the public treasury. That story was told by outsiders, so hold it loosely. But it survives because it captures something true. In Carthage, information was wealth, routes were secrets, and the sea itself was the empire. The empires you learnt about in school grew by taking land and holding it with soldiers. Carthage grew differently. Its most visible lines were not continuous borders, but harbours, sail lanes, alliance, tributary communities, and a few key territories, a web laid over the water, connecting ports from Africa to Spain to the islands, with every strand of it leading back to one city in North Africa. Think of it, for a moment, like a corporation with a flag, colonies as branch offices, the navy as security for the supply chain. It is a useful picture, but the picture only goes so far. Carthage was a state, not a company. It taxed and conscripted. It ruled subject communities in Africa who paid tribute whether they liked it or not. It held real territory in Sardinia, in western Sicily, and later in Spain, and it defended all of it with force. The corporate image explains how Carthage thought about profit. It does not soften how Carthage treated the people beneath it. That side of the ledger will come due later in this story, in blood. For now, follow the money. To the north lay Sardinia and the western tip of Sicily, holding harbours that sat astride the central sea lanes. Westward stretched the African coast, dotted with Phoenician towns that gradually looked to Carthage for protection. Beyond them stood the Strait of Gibraltar, the gateway to the Atlantic, which Carthage guarded jealously. Greek and Roman writers claimed that foreign ships caught trying to pass into the ocean risked being sunk. Formal policy or sailors' rumour. The message was received. The far west belonged to Carthage, and the far west held the treasure. Southern Spain was the great mining region of the ancient world, rich in silver beyond anything in the east. Phoenician traders had worked those coasts for generations, exchanging simple manufactured goods for precious metal at spectacular margins. Carthage inherited that trade and scaled it up. Spanish silver paid for fleets. Later, Spanish silver would pay for wars. When you watch an army cross the Alps later in this story, remember that it marched on Spanish silver. Then there was tin, the metal without which bronze cannot be made. And bronze was the working metal of the age. The richest known sources lay at the cold edge of the world, in northwestern Spain and, farther still, in Britain. How much of that trade Carthaginian ships carried directly, and how much passed through middlemen along the Atlantic coasts, is still debated. What is clear is that tin from the ocean routes flowed into the Mediterranean, and Carthage sat at the toll gate. Nothing shows the ambition better than the voyage of Hanno. Sometime around the 5th century BC, a Carthaginian commander of that name took a fleet through the Strait of Gibraltar and turned south, along the Atlantic coast of Africa, planting settlements and then pushing into waters no Mediterranean sailor had described. We know of it because a short account of the voyage, translated into Greek, survived when almost all other Carthaginian writing was lost. It is one of the only moments in this entire story when a Carthaginian speaks to us in something close to his own words. The account describes rivers full of crocodiles and hippos, night coasts glowing with fires, drumming in the darkness, and a mountain of flame towering above the sea. Some scholars have suggested that Burning Mountain was a volcano, though the geography of the voyage is much argued over. How far south Hanno reached, no one can say for certain. The point is not the mileage. While most sailors treated the Atlantic as the edge of the world, Carthage treated it as a market waiting to open. At the center of the web sat the city itself, and it grew rich in a way that impressed even its enemies. Ancient writers describe warehouses of ivory and linen, wine, salted fish, spices, on the fertile land behind the city. Carthaginian farmers became so skilled that a writer named Margot produced an agricultural manual famous across the ancient world. And here is a detail that says a great deal about how conquerors think. When Rome finally destroyed Carthage, the Roman Senate ordered Margot's farming work translated into Latin, while other Punic books, the tradition says, were handed away to African rulers. Rome kept the knowledge that made money. Most of the rest was left to burn or scatter. By the 4th century BC, the results were plain to everyone on the sea. Ancient writers remembered Carthage as extraordinarily wealthy, among the richest communities of its world. Its coins circulated from Africa to Spain. Its harbors handled cargo from 3 continents, and all of it depended on ships, and on the one thing ships cannot buy, which is skill. So what kind of city could run a network like that? What did it look like to walk through Carthage at its height? The answer surprised even the Greeks, and one part of it still divides historians today. Chapter 3. Inside the Forbidden City. Close your eyes and picture an ancient city. You are probably seeing marble temples, open plazas, statues of gods. Now clear that away and walk into Carthage in the 3rd century BC through the eyes of an imagined harbor worker. Call him a rope maker, coming up from the docks at the end of a working day. He is not a real, documented person. He is a device, a pair of borrowed eyes, and everything he passes is drawn from archaeology and from ancient descriptions of the city. Let him show us around. The first thing around him is height. The historian Appian, describing the city's final battle, tells of houses rising 6 stories along the streets that climb toward Bursa Hill. Our rope maker rents a room in one of them, above a dye cellar, below a family of sailors. The streets are narrow and loud, smelling of fish, tar, and the sea. On his way home, he passes warehouses with Spanish silver in their strong rooms, a shrine of the goddess Tanit at a corner, foreign sailors haggling in several tongues. Nowhere else in the Western Mediterranean did so many people live stacked on top of each other. Modern estimates of the city's population vary widely, but at its peak, Carthage may have housed well over 100,000 people, which placed it among the great cities of the earth in its day. Above the rooftops, on the landward side, run the walls. Carthage was ringed by more than 20 miles of fortifications, and ancient descriptions make the main land wall sound less like a barrier than a machine. Room inside its structure, we are told, for hundreds of war elephants, thousands of horses, and barracks for a small army, even allowing for exaggeration. The archaeology confirms defenses on a colossal scale. This was a city that expected to be attacked and intended to be unconquerable, but the wonder of wonders lay back down at the waterline, and our rope maker is one of the few ordinary citizens who has seen the inside of it. Because rope is one thing a navy always needs. Carthage built itself a double artificial harbour. The outer basin, rectangular, served the merchant fleet. Then, through a narrow channel, You entered something no other city possessed, a perfect circle of water, ringed by covered ship sheds, with an island at its center, where the admiral's tower rose high enough to watch the open sea, while hiding the fleet from every outside eye. This was the Kothon, the war harbour, with slips for 220 warships, according to Appian's account. From outside, a foreign captain saw nothing. A classified naval base, hidden in the middle of a shopping district. When archaeologists mapped the circular basin in the 20th century, its shape and scale matched the old descriptions closely. The lagoon is still there today. Quiet, dotted with small boats. Tourists walk past it without a second glance. They are looking at one of the most dangerous pieces of water in ancient history. Who ran all this? Here, Carthage breaks the stereotype most people carry about the ancient world. No king ruled Carthage in its mature centuries. The city was a republic. Each year, it elected 2 chief magistrates called suffetes, a word related to the Hebrew term for judges. Beside them sat a senate of the wealthy, an assembly of citizens, and a court of 104 judges whose job was to hold generals to account, which it did with a severity that could include crucifixion for commanders who failed badly enough. Aristotle himself analyzed the Carthaginian constitution in his Politics and ranked it alongside the most admired Greek systems, noting with some surprise that Carthage had avoided both tyranny and major uprising for centuries. Sit with that for a second. While most of the world bowed to kings, North Africa was home to an elected government that one of Greece's greatest minds treated as a model worth studying. Aristotle's sharpest criticism was that wealth counted for too much in Carthaginian politics. That office could effectively be bought. An ancient philosopher worrying about money in politics. Some problems do not age. Over this commercial republic watched the gods. And with the gods, we reach the hardest part of this entire story. So let me slow down and be precise. Because this is exactly where a careless documentary becomes a dishonest one. The chief gods of Carthage were Baal, Hammon, and the goddess Tanit, whose sign, a simple figure of a triangle, a circle, and outstretched arms, appears on thousands of Carthaginian stones. Greek and Roman writers claimed something monstrous about this religion. They wrote that in times of crisis, Carthaginian families sacrificed infants and young children to the gods. For a long time, many modern historians dismissed this as enemy propaganda. Then archaeologists at Carthage uncovered a sacred precinct, now called the Tophet, holding thousands of small urns buried over centuries, containing the cremated remains of infants and very young children, along with animal offerings, under stones carved with vows to Baal, Hammon, and Tanit. What does it mean? The experts genuinely divide, and you deserve the current state of the argument, not a cartoon of it. Some scholars have interpreted the Tophet primarily as a special cemetery for babies who died naturally, in an age of crushing infant mortality, reading the vows as grief rather than sacrifice. But many researchers now consider it likely that at least some of these children were sacrificed, perhaps especially in moments of extreme danger for the city, because that is where the inscriptions, the ancient testimony, and parts of the physical evidence appear to point. How often it happened, and exactly how, remains disputed. 2 things can be true at once. Rome, which buried people alive in its own forum during its own crises, was not a neutral witness, and the urns are real. The Tophet is the darkest room in the Carthaginian house, and we will leave its door open rather than pretend we hold the key. Step back into the sunlight with our rope maker and take the city in one last time. The tall houses, the elected judges, the circular harbour hiding a fleet behind a wall, the warehouses, the farms, The temples. By around 300 BC, this city was, by most measures that matter, the leading power of the Western Mediterranean. But it had not grown up in an empty sea. For centuries, Carthage had been locked in rivalry with another brilliant seafaring civilization, and the two of them had turned one island into their permanent battleground. Long before any Carthaginian had reason to fear the name of Rome, the rival was Greek, and the island was Sicily. That struggle is next, and it opens with a battle that Greek storytellers insisted was fought on the same day as one of the most famous battles in all of history. Chapter 4. The Greek Wars. If you want to understand why Carthage was so dangerous by the time Rome finally faced it, you have to look at Sicily, and at the enemy who taught Carthage how to fight. Rome never faced a young Carthage. It faced a Carthage that had been sharpened for generations against some of the most formidable soldiers of the ancient world. The Greeks. Look at a map, and the collision seems almost unavoidable. Sicily sits in the narrow middle of the sea like a stepping stone between Africa and Europe, and its western tip lies less than 100 miles from Carthage itself. Phoenician traders settled the island's western end. Greek colonists, arriving wave after wave, settled the east, and their greatest city, Syracuse, grew strong enough to dream of ruling the whole island. Two expanding civilizations. One island. No referee. The result was a rivalry that flared into open war again and again across roughly 3 centuries. Not one continuous war, but a long fever that kept breaking and returning. Treaty after treaty. Generation after generation. The first great explosion came at a city called Himera. In the year 480 BC, a Carthaginian general landed with a huge army to break Greek power in Sicily, and the Greek cities, led by Syracuse, crushed him. The defeat was total, enough to keep Carthage largely out of Sicilian wars for the next 70 years. And Greek writers added a detail almost too perfect to be true. They claimed Himera was fought on the very same day that the Greeks of the homeland destroyed the Persian fleet at Salamis. 2 invasions of the Greek world, defeated in a single day at opposite ends of the sea. Modern historians treat that timing as patriotic storytelling, and so should you. But the story reveals how the Greeks saw Carthage, not as a trading partner with a grievance, as the Persia of the West, the great foreign menace. The other. Pause on that, because you have now seen it twice. First, in the founding legends, and now here. Long before Rome wrote a word about Carthage, Greek authors had already drawn the villain. Cruel, faithless, money-loving, foreign. When Roman writers later reached for insults, they did not need to invent anything. They inherited a finished portrait, the way one generation inherits a prejudice from another. When Carthage returned to Sicily in force, near the end of the 5th century BC, the wars turned savage. Carthaginian armies destroyed Himera in revenge, then destroyed other wealthy Greek cities in turn. Syracuse answered with one of the most formidable rulers of the age, the tyrant Dionysius, who turned his city into a fortress and a weapons laboratory. Ancient sources credit his engineers with new inventions, including early forms of the catapult, developed for his wars against Carthage. The fighting was merciless on both sides. Cities were stormed and their people slaughtered street by street. Carthage struck deep into Greek Sicily, then saw its own armies wrecked by plague outside Syracuse. Back and forth it went, decade after decade, and the frontier between Greek and Carthaginian Sicily kept snapping back, again and again, to roughly the same line on the map. Neither civilization could finish the other. Then, at the end of the 4th century BC, a Syracusan ruler named Agathocles changed the rules of the entire game. with a Carthaginian army camped outside his own walls. He did something no Greek commander had ever dared. Rather than defend, he loaded an army onto ships, slipped past the blockade, sailed to North Africa, and burned his own ships on the beach so that no man could dream of retreat. Then he marched on Carthage. The gamble nearly worked. His army won battles on African soil, plundered the rich countryside, and threw the city into panic. It was in this crisis, the sources say, that leading Carthaginian families turned to their darkest ritual to win back the favor of the gods. We face that contested evidence honestly in the last chapter, and this is the kind of desperate moment the sacrifice tradition attaches to. In the end, Agathocles overreached, and his African adventure collapsed. But he had proved a theory that no one forgot. Carthage was a sea monster. On land, at home, in Africa. It was soft. File that away. A century later, a Roman general would exploit exactly the same weakness, and Carthage would pay the full price of the demonstration. By the early 3rd century BC, the long Greek fever had burned down to a wary balance. Carthage could not conquer eastern Sicily. The Greeks could not expel Carthage from the west. Then a Greek king named Pyrrhus crossed into Italy with a professional army and war elephants to fight a rising city there, and afterward crossed into Sicily to fight Carthage too. He beat both of them in battle after battle, and won nothing lasting from either, bleeding away his men in victories so costly that his name still lives in the phrase, a Pyrrhic victory, as he finally sailed away from Sicily. Ancient writers put a prophecy in his mouth. What a wrestling ground we are leaving behind us. He said, for Carthage and Rome. Rome, the city has been growing quietly in the background of this story for 200 years. It is time to turn and face it. Chapter 5. 2 cities. 1 sea. Here is a fact that surprises almost everyone. For most of their shared history, Carthage and Rome were not enemies. They were something closer to partners. The proof comes from Polybius, and it is worth a moment to meet him properly, because he is our single best guide from here to the end of this story. Polybius was a Greek statesman taken to Rome as a political hostage, who became a companion of Rome's leading families and set out to explain, for Greek readers, how Rome had conquered the known world within a single long lifetime. He interviewed veterans. He walked the battlefields. At the end of this story, he will stand beside the Roman commander and personally watch Carthage burn. He admired Rome and had every reason to flatter it, which makes it all the more striking when his evidence cuts the other way. It often does. On early Rome and Carthage, it does. Polybius records a series of treaties between the two republics, and he dates the first to the very beginning of the Roman Republic, around 509 BC. So old that he admits the archaic Latin was hard, even for learned Romans of his own day, to read. In these treaties, the two cities divided the sea, like neighbors agreeing on a fence line. Roman traders accepted limits in Carthaginian waters. Carthage promised to keep its hands off Rome's corner of Italy. Later treaties renewed the bargain, and when Pyrrhus attacked them both, the two cities even agreed to support each other, and a Carthaginian fleet sailed to Rome's aid. For 2.5 centuries, the future deadliest enemies of the ancient world were, on paper and mostly in practice, friends. So what were these two partners actually like? Set them side by side, because the contrast explains almost everything that follows. Carthage, as you have seen, was a web of salt water with a hard territorial core. Its strength was money, ships, and skill. Its armies were layered, citizen troops for the gravest emergencies, Libyan subjects and allied contingents as a backbone, and large numbers of hired professionals, Iberians, Gauls, Greeks, recruited for wars as wars arose. For a trading state with a limited citizen body, hiring soldiers was rational policy. It kept the workforce working and put experienced fighters in the field quickly. But it carried a hidden cost. Armies, bound to their paymaster and their general, are loyal exactly as long as the pay arrives. Hold that thought for 2 chapters. Rome was a different animal altogether. A city of farmers that had spent those same centuries conquering Italy field by field, and had built its power on 2 ideas that seem ordinary now and were revolutionary then. First, the citizen soldier. Every Roman farmer of property owed military service. Rome did not buy its armies. It grew them. Second, and stranger, Rome shared. When Rome defeated an Italian people, it did not simply plunder and leave. It bound the defeated to itself as allies, and over time extended rights, and sometimes citizenship itself, to former enemies. Each conquest enlarged the next army. Polybius marveled at the arithmetic. By the era of the wars with Carthage, Rome and its allies could draw on manpower reserves in the hundreds of thousands. A well so deep that no single defeat, however terrible, could empty it. Hold those 2 systems in your mind, because the entire war between these cities is a contest between them, a power that turned money into fleets, against a power that turned defeated enemies into more Romans, a state that thought in profit and loss, against a state that thought in generations. Each side kept expecting the other to behave sensibly, by its own definition of sense, and kept being wrong. That misunderstanding is about to kill hundreds of thousands of people. By the 260s BC, the old fence between them had nearly vanished. Rome now controlled the Italian peninsula down to the toe of the boot. Carthage still held western Sicily. Between them lay only the Strait of Messina, a strip of water so narrow that a man on the Italian shore can see Sicily with his naked eye. The spark, when it came, was almost absurdly small. A gang of Italian mercenaries had seized the Sicilian city of Messana on that strait, killing the men and taking the women. Squeezed between an angry Syracuse and an expanding Carthage, these hijackers appealed for protection in 2 directions at once, to Carthage and to Rome. Polybius tells us the Roman Senate hesitated, understanding exactly what was at stake. It was the assembly of the people, hungry for the plunder of a rich island, that voted to go. In the year 264 BC, a Roman consular army crossed the strait into Sicily, the first time Rome sent an army to fight beyond the Italian mainland. Neither city knew it yet, but the long partnership was dead. What began that year, over 1 stolen town, would become one of the longest continuous wars of the entire ancient world. Chapter 6. The First Punic War. The war that began over 1 stolen town lasted 23 years. Think about what that number means. A Roman boy who watched his father march off to Sicily in the first campaign could grow up, marry, and send his own son to the same war before it ended. Polybius called it the longest and most continuously fought war he knew of. And he did not mean it as a compliment to either side. It was a war that neither city knew how to win, and neither knew how to quit. On paper, the matchup made little sense. Carthage was the leading naval power of the Western Sea, with generations of seamanship and fortified harbours across Sicily. Rome had ships and coastal allies, but no major battle fleet. Nothing remotely capable of challenging Carthage on open water. Roman soldiers had crossed to Messana, partly on borrowed and hired boats. A war for an island, against master sailors, waged by a nation of farmers. Every informed observer could see how it had to end. The opening years followed the script. Rome won on land, as Rome usually did. pushing the Carthaginians back toward their fortress ports in western Sicily. And there the advance stopped. Because it had to. As long as Carthage ruled the water, its strongholds could be supplied by sea forever. And Carthaginian raiders could burn the coasts of Italy at will. Rome faced a plain conclusion. To win Sicily, it would have to beat Carthage at sea, which was, by any reasonable reading, impossible. What Rome did next reveals the Roman character better than any speech. According to the tradition Polybius records, a Carthaginian warship ran aground early in the war and fell into Roman hands intact. The Romans dragged it ashore, studied it, and used it as a template, building copies by the score, while crews learned to row on benches set up on dry land, practicing their strokes before they ever touched water. Historians debate the details, and Rome certainly drew on the skills of Greek shipwrights in southern Italy. But the essential fact is confirmed by what happened next. In a remarkably short time, a nation of farmers built a battle fleet, partly by reverse engineering the enemy's own technology. It should not have been enough. Ships can be copied. 100 years of seamanship cannot. So Rome changed the game instead. Roman engineers fitted their ships with a device the sailors nicknamed the corvus. The raven. Picture a heavy boarding bridge, about 4 feet wide and 36 feet long, mounted upright at the bow, with a great iron spike, like a bird's beak, under its far end. When an enemy ship came close, the bridge crashed down, the spike bit into the enemy deck, and the two ships were nailed together. At that instant, the sea battle ended, and a land battle began, on planks. And nobody on earth beat Roman infantry on solid footing. The device was crude and ugly. It may also have made the ships less stable, though historians still argue how much blame it deserves for later disasters in storms. What is beyond argument is that it worked. At Mylae, in 260 BC, the new Roman fleet met the Carthaginians, who came on almost contemptuously. The ravens came down, and Rome won the first great naval victory in its history. The victorious consul was honored with a column in the Forum decorated with the bronze rams of captured ships. Fragments of its inscription survive to this day. Here is the lesson of this entire war, and it is worth stating once. Plainly, Carthage was better at sea, and it did not matter. Because Rome refused to keep fighting the war Carthage was better at. Every time the Romans lost by the old rules, they changed the rules. Carthage kept trying to be Carthage. Rome was willing to become anything. Confidence swelling. Rome now reached for the Agathocles play and invaded Africa itself. A vast Roman fleet smashed through the Carthaginian navy at Ecnomus, in what may have been, by the number of men engaged, one of the largest naval battles of the ancient world. The consul Regulus landed in Africa, won on land, and pushed Carthage towards surrender. His terms were so crushing that Carthage chose to fight on, and desperation produced salvation. Among the professionals in Carthaginian service was a Spartan officer named Xanthippus, who looked at the army, declared that its cavalry and elephants were being wasted, and was handed effective command, on flat ground of his choosing. Xanthippus destroyed the Roman army and captured Regulus. Rome's African gamble ended in ruin, and worse, followed at sea. The fleet, sent to evacuate the survivors, was wrecked in a storm off Sicily, with the loss of enormous numbers of men in a single tempest. Across the war, storms may have cost Rome more ships and men than Carthaginian action ever did. A word about Regulus, because his afterlife is a perfect specimen of how memory gets made. Later, Roman legend claimed that Carthage sent the captive Regulus to Rome to negotiate, on his oath to return. He advised the Senate to refuse the terms, kept his oath, walked back into captivity, and was tortured to death. It became one of the most famous stories in Roman literature, and it is very likely not true. At least not the torture. Polybius, our earliest and best source, says nothing of it, and many historians suspect the tale was polished or invented, partly to excuse cruelties inflicted on Carthaginian prisoners in Rome. Notice the pattern. Rome loses a general to his own harsh terms, and history somehow receives another story about Carthaginian savagery. The war ground on in a way that almost defies narration. Rome built fleets, and storms ate them. Ancient figures for Roman ship losses across the war run very high, and historians treat the exact numbers with caution. But the scale of loss was staggering by any count, and much of it came from weather rather than battle. Any other state in the Mediterranean would have broken. Rome taxed itself grey and built again. In Sicily, the fighting shrank to endless sieges of the last Carthaginian fortress ports, and in those final years, Carthage found its best commander of the war, a young general named Hamilcar Barca, who seized a mountain base and waged brilliant raiding warfare. A commander, the Romans, never decisively defeated in the field. Remember the family name, Barca. It is about to become the most important name in this entire story. The end came the way Carthaginian accountants had always feared: money and shipyards. In the war's 22nd year, with the Roman treasury exhausted, Rome's wealthiest citizens financed one final fleet, essentially by private loan, to be repaid only in victory. It was a leaner fleet, stripped of the heavy ravens, crewed by veterans. Carthage sent out a fleet burdened with supplies and rowed by undertrained crews, off the Aegates Islands near Sicily. In March of 241 BC, the Romans caught them in rough water and shattered them. In recent years, archaeologists have raised bronze warship rams from the seabed at the site, some inscribed in Latin, some in Punic, the actual teeth of the battle that decided the war, still lying where the ships went down. At his mountain base, Hamilcar Barca, undefeated, received orders from a bankrupt government to negotiate. Carthage gave up Sicily entirely and agreed to pay a massive indemnity in silver over 20 years. After more than 2 decades, the longest war of its age was over, at a cost in lives that ancient figures, counting both sides and the drowned, push into the hundreds of thousands. Except that for Carthage, the worst was not over. The worst was about to walk in through the front gate, and it would not be wearing a Roman uniform. Chapter 7. The Truceless War. Ask people to name the most vicious war of the ancient world, and they will reach for famous ones. Almost nobody names the war that historians, following Polybius, call the Truceless War, and there is a reason for the silence. No one was proud of it. It has no heroes. It was a war between Carthage and its own unpaid soldiers, and Polybius, who studied wars all his life, judged that it surpassed every conflict he knew in cruelty. Here is how it began. For 23 years, Carthage had fought Rome with layered armies, and the professional core of those armies, Libyans, Iberians, Gauls, Greeks, slingers from the Balearic Islands, was owed money. A great deal of money, the accumulated pay for years of service. Now the war was lost. The treasury was drained by the Roman indemnity, and roughly 20,000 of these veterans were shipped home from Sicily to Africa, where they camped near Carthage and waited for what they were owed. The government's plan was to gather them in one place and negotiate the bill down. Concentrate 20,000 armed, angry, unpaid veterans outside your capital, and haggle. It is hard to describe this as anything but one of the worst decisions in the history of accounting. The camp seethed, promises slipped, offers changed. The fuse burned down. The soldiers mutinied, seized the town of Tunis within sight of Carthage's walls, and found leaders as hard as the moment demanded. A runaway Roman slave named Spendius and a Libyan soldier named Mathos. And then the revolt became something far larger than a pay dispute. Mathos sent word to the Libyan subject communities of Africa, the people who had been squeezed for tribute for generations, and squeezed hardest during the Roman war. Africa exploded. Polybius says the Libyans rushed to the cause almost as one, swelling the rebel armies to numbers he puts at 70,000. Even Libyan women, he records, gave up their jewelry to fund the rebellion. Stop on that detail. When the subjects of an empire donate their gold to the people burning it down, the empire is learning what its subjects actually thought of it. The web of salt water had a landward side. Carthage had treated that side as a resource rather than a partner. And the bill for a century of squeezing arrived all at once. So before this story asks you to grieve for Carthage, hold this chapter against it. Carthage was not only a victim of empires, it was one. The city itself, nearly bankrupt and cut off from its African hinterland, was fighting for its existence within walking distance of its own gates. In this darkest hour, it finally gave full command to the man it had shortchanged in Sicily, Hamilcar Barca. What followed was a masterclass conducted in a slaughterhouse. Hamilcar slipped an army across a river, mouth the rebels believed impassable, using a sandbar that formed under certain winds. A trick of local knowledge he had studied, and they had not. He defeated larger forces with smaller ones. He spared and recruited prisoners, bleeding the mutiny of men. He was joined by a Numidian prince named Naravas, who rode over to him with his cavalry out of admiration and was rewarded with the hand of Hamilcar's daughter. Slowly, the professionals strangled the uprising. The rebel leaders understood exactly what the recruitment of prisoners meant for their cause, and they answered it with calculated horror. To make peace impossible, to weld their men together with shared guilt, they murdered their Carthaginian prisoners. Among them, a captured commander who had once dealt with the soldiers honestly. The sources describe deliberate mutilation and a mass killing that I will summarize rather than repeat. From that day, Polybius writes, the war was truceless, in fact as well as name. Hamilcar answered atrocity with atrocity of his own. Neither side took prisoners any longer. Polybius holds the whole episode up, coldly, as proof of how far men fall when war stops being policy and becomes hatred. I will follow his example, and not linger. The end came with grim arithmetic. Hamilcar trapped a huge rebel force in a mountain defile called the Soar, penned it there without supplies, and let hunger do the killing. Polybius reports that the trapped men were destroyed to the last after being reduced to the most desperate extremes. Spendius died on a cross before the walls of Tunis. Mathos was taken when the final rebel stronghold fell, and died a public and terrible death in the streets of Carthage. After more than 3 years, around 238 BC, the Truceless War was over. Carthage had survived a second existential war within a single decade. And it was precisely then, with Carthage bled white and barely standing, that Rome delivered the most cynical blow in this entire story. During the revolt, the Carthaginian garrison on Sardinia had mutinied too, and eventually invited Rome in. Rome, which had actually behaved decently through most of the crisis, even allowing Italian merchants to supply Carthage, now reversed itself. It accepted Sardinia, and when Carthage prepared an expedition to recover its own island, Rome declared that preparation an act of war, and demanded Sardinia plus an additional payment of silver as the price of peace. Carthage, in no condition to fight anyone, submitted. Polybius the great admirer of Rome, does not even try to defend this. He calls the seizure contrary to all justice, and he points to Sardinia, and to the anger it planted in Carthaginian hearts, as one of the true causes of the far greater war to come. Consider the chain, because history rarely forges one so clean. A war fought partly with rented loyalty, a bankruptcy that turned the rented men into enemies, a revolt that exposed the resentment underneath the empire, and a rival that waited for the weakest possible moment to take, legally and politely, what it could never have taken in battle. Hamilcar Barca watched all of it, the army he had led and could not pay, the government that had failed it, the island signed away at the point of maximum weakness. Ancient writers, and most historians since, connect what he did next to that experience. He gathered his veterans and his ambitions and sailed west, to Spain, to the silver, to build something new beyond the reach of the politicians who had twice presided over failure. He took his family with him, among them a 9-year-old boy named Hannibal. Chapter 8. The Oath of the Boy. Somewhere around the year 237 BC, in a temple in Carthage, a father prepared a sacrifice before leaving for Spain, and his 9-year-old son begged to come along. The father agreed, on one condition. He led the boy to the altar, placed the child's hand upon the offering, and made him swear an oath: never be a friend to Rome. We know this story from a remarkable chain of testimony. Decades later, an old man in exile told it about himself to a foreign king, to prove he could be trusted to fight Rome to the end. That old man was Hannibal, and Polybius says the account reached him through people connected to that king's court. Historians still debate how literally to take a childhood memory retold for political effect, and so should we. But no other anecdote from the ancient world explains the next 40 years of Mediterranean history so well. Whatever happened at that altar, Hannibal lived his entire life as if the oath were real. Understand what Hamilcar Barca was doing when he sailed west, because it was stranger than a general taking a new posting. Carthage had lost Sicily, lost Sardinia, and nearly lost itself. Its treasury owed Rome a mountain of silver. Hamilcar's answer was to rebuild Carthaginian power where Rome was not looking, in Spain, where the silver came from. With his veterans and his sons-in-law, he carved out a new dominion among the Iberian tribes. Part conquest, part alliance, part business. The mines went into overdrive, the tribute flowed, and crucially, the army that grew in Spain was loyal first to the Barca family, paid by Barca silver, led by Barca commanders. Some historians describe Barcid Spain as almost a kingdom within the Republic, and politicians back in Carthage grumbled exactly that. But the silver paid Rome's indemnity and refilled the city's accounts. In Carthage, money was an argument that usually won. Hamilcar never saw the harvest. Around 229 BC, he died on campaign, drowned, according to one account, while drawing enemies away from his sons. Command passed to his son-in-law Hasdrubal, called the Fair, a diplomat more than a soldier, who consolidated the province and founded a gleaming capital on the coast. New Carthage. Walk the harbour of that city today, modern Cartagena in Spain, and you can still see why he chose it. One of the finest natural anchorages in the western Mediterranean, ringed by hills, with the old silver country at its back. It was Hasdrubal who signed a quiet agreement with Rome fixing the Ebro River, far to the north, as the limit of Carthaginian expansion. Remember that river. In about 10 minutes, lawyers will be arguing over it with armies. Then, in 221 BC, Hasdrubal was assassinated by a servant with a private grievance. And the army in Spain did something that shows where power in that province truly lived. Without waiting for instructions from Carthage, the soldiers gathered and acclaimed as their commander Hamilcar's eldest son, a young man of about 26. The government back home could only confirm what the army had already decided. Hannibal Barca had his command. What kind of man had the boy at the altar become? The Roman historian Livy, no friend of Carthage, left a portrait so admiring it startles you coming from an enemy, fearless in taking on danger, supremely calm inside it, first into the fight, last to leave it, sleeping on the bare ground in a soldier's cloak among his sentries, eating what the men ate, marked out from them by nothing but the quality of his horse and his weapons. Then Livy appends the standard catalogue of vices: cruelty beyond the human norm, treachery worse than Punic. Modern historians note that specific, verifiable atrocities are surprisingly hard to pin on Hannibal, and that faithlessness was the insult Rome applied to Carthaginians as a matter of national habit. Read the praise as observation and the venom as branding. Hannibal spent 2 years securing the Spanish tribes, then turned to the city everyone knew would be the flashpoint: Saguntum, a fortified town on the Spanish coast, well south of the Ebro, deep inside what Carthage considered its sphere. At some point, Saguntum had placed itself under Roman protection, and its politics had turned sharply against Carthage. Here the lawyering starts, and it has never really stopped. Rome claimed its ally was untouchable. Carthage could answer that Saguntum lay south of the Ebro boundary, well inside its own zone. But the truth is that the legal question was genuinely tangled. The Ebro Treaty limited Carthaginian expansion to the north. It did not clearly settle the fate of a Roman friend to the south. And Rome's separate relationship with Saguntum left just enough room for both sides to feel wronged. Polybius reviews the treaties like an attorney and concludes, quietly, that Rome's case was weaker than Rome pretended, and that the real causes of the coming war lay deeper: the anger over Sardinia, the rebuilt power of the Bacchus, 2 empires that had run out of sea to share. In 219 BC, Hannibal besieged Saguntum. Rome sent stern words and no soldiers. For 8 brutal months the town held out. In the tradition Livy preserves, its leading citizens burned their possessions and themselves rather than surrender. When Saguntum fell, Rome sent an embassy to Carthage with an ultimatum: hand over Hannibal, or accept war. In the Carthaginian Senate, the chief Roman envoy gathered a fold of his toga and held it out. "Here I carry peace and war," he said. In the scene both Polybius and Livy record, "Choose which you will have." The Carthaginians, unwilling to hand the son of Hamilcar to a Roman executioner, answered that he should give whichever he wished. He let the fold drop. War, then, and the senators of Carthage shouted back their acceptance. The Second Punic War had begun, and both sides assumed they knew its shape. Rome now ruled the sea. Rome would land armies in Spain and in Africa, and Carthage would defend. Roman fleets and legions were already assembling for exactly that script. Hannibal had read the same script, which is why he chose the one move it declared impossible. He would not wait in Spain. He would not defend at all. He would carry the war into Italy itself. By land, a march of 1,000 miles from his base, across 2 mountain ranges, through hostile tribal country, over rivers armies were not supposed to cross, and finally over the Alps, racing the winter. In the spring of 218 BC, he marched north out of New Carthage. After crossing the Ebro, Polybius credits him with roughly 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. And even if those ancient figures are generous, the scale of the gamble is beyond dispute. The most famous journey in military history was underway. Chapter 9. Elephants in the Snow. Let us be honest about the elephants, because they have hijacked this story for 2,000 years. 37 elephants marched with Hannibal, and they mattered far less than the men. But the elephants are why you have heard of this march. And even the ancients could not look away. There is something in the image that refuses to fade. The largest land animal on earth. A creature of African heat, picking its way along an icy ledge above the clouds. If Carthage had a genius for anything, it was moving cargo where cargo was not supposed to go. This was the ultimate delivery. The march began as a running fight. From the Ebro to the Pyrenees, Hannibal hammered through resisting tribes and left garrisons behind to hold what he had taken. At the Pyrenees, he did something revealing. He released every man whose heart was not in it. Thousands of them, sent home without punishment or shame. He would rather cross the mountains with fewer believers than more passengers. The army that entered Gaul was smaller, harder, and entirely his. At the Rhone River came the first masterpiece. The river was wide and fast, and the far bank bristled with hostile Gallic warriors waiting to butcher an army in mid-crossing. Hannibal sent a detachment upstream by night, crossed it quietly, and looped it behind the enemy camp. Then he launched his main force over the river in full view. Boats and rafts against the current. Exactly the suicide the Gauls expected. When a smoke signal rose behind the enemy, the hidden force fell on their camp. The defenders dissolved, and the crossing was won. Note the signature, because you will see it again. Hannibal did not beat you where you were looking. He beat you from the direction you had already decided was safe. The elephants crossed on great earth-covered rafts, disguised, Polybius says, to look like solid ground. Some panicked and plunged in anyway, and swam or walked the river bottom with trunks raised like snorkels. Remarkably, the sources say none were lost. In these same days, Roman cavalry, scouting inland from the coast, collided with Hannibal's horsemen, and Rome understood, with a jolt, that the Carthaginian army was no longer in Spain. The consul Publius Cornelius Scipio raced back to Italy to organize a defense, and sent the army on to Spain under his brother. Hold that quiet decision in your memory. The army that continued to Spain, and the family name Scipio, will decide this entire war, though not for years yet. Then the Alps. It was now autumn, dangerously late for the high passes. Which pass Hannibal took is one of the oldest arguments in historical geography, and whole books disagree. So this video will not pretend to settle it. What the sources give us, Polybius above all, who says he questioned men who were on the march and later walked the route himself, is a slow-motion catastrophe in 9 days of climbing. The mountain tribes learned quickly that an army strung out single file on a track is not an army. It is a line of victims. They rolled boulders from above. They cut the column at the choke points and slaughtered the baggage sections. At one point, Hannibal fought through a full night and day to retake his own supply train. The sources describe pack animals, struck by missiles, plunging off the track into the gorges and taking men with them. Near the summit, with the army bleeding strength daily, the first snow of the new winter began to fall on the frozen crust of the old. Polybius records the scene that has fixed itself in memory ever since. The exhausted army camped at the top of Europe, and Hannibal did the one thing left to a commander whose men were dying of despair. He gathered them at a lookout and showed them Italy, the plains of the Po, hazy and golden below the clouds. Those slopes, he told them, in the account our sources preserve, were the walls of Rome, and the army had already scaled them. Everything from here was downhill. He was lying about that. as motivators sometimes must. The descent was worse. The Italian side was steeper, and fresh snow hid sheets of old ice. Men who slipped simply left the story. At the worst point, a landslide had erased the track above a precipice, and the army stalled in the freezing dark. What happened next is one of my favorite moments in ancient history, because it is not a miracle. It is engineering. The soldiers rebuilt the path by hand, course by course, where a great boulder blocked the way. The sources describe them stacking felled trees against it, firing the wood until the rock glowed. And then, in a detail Livy adds, pouring their ration vinegar into the cracks so the stones split and could be pried apart with iron tools. Engineers have argued about the vinegar ever since, and fire alone can crack stone. Either way, the meaning is the same. The Alps did not defeat this army, because this army treated the Alps as a job site. 1 day to open a track for the horses, 3 days to bring the surviving elephants down, then grass, and warmth, and Italy. Now count the cost. The force that had numbered around 90,000 infantry after the Ebro stepped into Italy, with about 20,000 foot and 6,000 horse. But do not imagine all the missing died on the peaks. Garrisons left behind in Spain and Gaul. Contingents dismissed at the Pyrenees. Hard fighting along the way. Desertion. And finally, the mountains had each taken their share. What reached Italy was not a wrecked army. It was a deliberately concentrated one. Small, hard, and entirely committed. Still, by every military textbook, Hannibal had lost before he began. He stood in enemy country, outnumbered many times over by a state that could draw. Polybius reckoned on manpower reserves in the hundreds of thousands, with no supply line, no port, and winter at his back. Rome's leaders, once the shock passed, drew the obvious conclusion. The madman had wrecked himself on the rocks. The legions would sweep up what was left. The obvious conclusion lasted about a month. In December, on the Trebia River, Rome discovered what the survivors could do. Hannibal spent days studying the opposing consul, Sempronius Longus, and diagnosed him precisely. Aggressive, hungry for glory, desperate to win the war before his term of office expired. So Hannibal built a trap out of the man's own personality. The night before, he hid 2,000 picked men under his brother Mago in a brush-choked stream bed on the open plain. Ground the Romans had dismissed because it looked empty. At dawn, his light cavalry rode up to insult the Roman camp and pull its army out, unfed, into a sleeting winter morning. Then let it wade the freezing, swollen river, chest deep, cold, hungry, and soaked. The legions formed up in front of a rested, fed Carthaginian army that had spent the morning warming itself at fires. The Roman center fought magnificently, even so, punching clean through the line in front of it. It did not matter. The wings collapsed. The elephants and Spaniards ground in on the flanks. And then Mago's 2,000 rose out of the empty streambed into the Roman rear, of some 40,000 Romans and allies. The ancient accounts suggest barely a quarter cut their way out as a formed body. The rest were killed, captured, or scattered into the winter river. In the spring, Hannibal did it again. On a grander scale, he marched south through flooded marshland, the Romans considered impassable. 4 days and nights in the water. There he lost the sight of one eye to infection, and rode on, reportedly on one of the few surviving elephants, a one-eyed general on a war beast wading through a drowned land. He slipped past the waiting consul Flaminius and began burning the countryside behind him, daring the man to chase. Flaminius chased. Exactly as diagnosed. Straight along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, where the road threaded a narrow passage between the hills and the water. Drive that shoreline today, and it is postcard Italy. Olive groves and quiet villages above a silver lake. On a June morning in 217 BC, the entire Carthaginian army stood hidden in the mist on those hills. What followed, Polybius and Livy agree, was less a battle than an execution. Trumpets in the fog. An army struck simultaneously along miles of marching column, with no time to form ranks and nowhere to go but the lake. Around 15,000 Romans died, the consul among them, some drowning in their armor as they waded out until the water closed over them. It remains one of the largest and most devastating ambushes recorded in ancient warfare. Local tradition still preserves place names near that shore that remember blood. 2 consular armies had been annihilated inside 6 months by the smaller force. Both times, in Rome, a magistrate climbed the speaker's platform and told the crowd the plain truth in a single sentence. We have been defeated in a great battle. Rome's answer to that sentence would define the Roman character forever. And Hannibal's answer to Rome would produce, on a summer field in the south called Cannae, one of the most catastrophic single days in Roman history. Chapter 10. Cannae, the perfect kill. After Trasimene, Rome did something almost unheard of in its history. It admitted it was afraid. The Republic appointed a dictator, an emergency office with supreme power, and the man chosen, Quintus Fabius Maximus, looked at the record. 3 battles, 3 disasters, and drew a conclusion of pure, cold sanity. Stop fighting Hannibal. Not, stop fighting the war. Stop fighting the man. Fabius shadowed the Carthaginian army along the high ground, refusing every invitation to battle, burning crops in its path, cutting off foragers, letting hunger and distance do what legions could not. It was strategy as siege, with all of Italy as the castle. Rome hated it. Romans called Fabius the delayer, and they did not mean it kindly. Not yet. His own second-in-command publicly accused him of cowardice. Hannibal, who understood Roman politics as well as he understood terrain, did everything possible to make Fabius look like a traitor, even ordering the delayer's own farms spared while the neighboring lands burned. And when Fabius briefly trapped the Carthaginian army in a valley with troops holding the only pass, Hannibal escaped by night with one of the most theatrical tricks in military history. His men drove 2,000 oxen up the hillsides with burning bundles of wood tied to their horns. The Roman garrison, seeing rivers of torchlight moving across the heights, left the pass to chase the lights, and the whole army walked out through the open door, plunder and all. When the dictatorship expired, Roman patience expired with it. The politics of the year 216 BC demanded a final, overwhelming answer, and the Republic assembled one. Polybius describes a mobilization unlike anything Rome had attempted. 8 legions, plus allied contingents, fielded together. A combined force, our sources put at around 86,000 men, roughly double any army Rome had ever placed on one battlefield. Both consuls of the year, Varro and Paulus, marched with it. The tradition, mostly following Livy, paints Varro as the reckless commoner and Paulus as the wise aristocrat. And modern historians warn that this neat portrait was polished afterward by noble families with reputations to protect. Someone would need to be blamed. They found Hannibal in the south, near a supply depot on the Aufidus River called Cannae. Go there today, and you find low hills above a wide, quiet plain in Puglia, wheat and wind, and a small ruin on a rise. It is hard to stand in that emptiness and believe what the sources say happened in it. This was open ground. Cavalry country. The exact terrain Roman officers equated with safety. Because nothing could hide there. No hills for ambush. No fog. Whatever happened at Cannae would happen in plain sight. On the 2nd of August, around 50,000 men under Hannibal formed up, facing the largest army in Roman history. What happened next is still taught in military academies on every continent, and it can be described with terrible simplicity. Hannibal arranged his line as a crescent bulging toward the enemy. At the tip of the bulge, he placed his Gauls and Spaniards. His best African veterans he held back. At the two ends, he offered the Romans exactly what they wanted: a straight-ahead smashing match against a visibly thin center. The legions, packed unusually deep, drove into that center and pushed it back and back, and the crescent bent inward. From a bulge to a line to a bowl, 80,000 men crowded forward into the deepening pocket, each rank pushing the one ahead, tasting victory. They were not breaking the Carthaginian line. They were being swallowed by it. On the flanks, Hannibal's heavy cavalry destroyed the Roman horse, then swung around the entire battle and struck the legions from behind. And now, the African veterans, at the two ends of the bowl, simply turned inward. Left face, right face. The pocket became a room. The room had no doors. What followed was not a battle, but an unmaking, jammed shoulder to shoulder. Most Romans could not raise their weapons, could not turn, could barely see. Polybius notes, with dry precision, that the encirclement made every part of the Roman army a front line and a rear at once. The killing took the rest of the day, and the numbers still stop historians cold. Polybius reckons about 70,000 Romans and allies killed. Livy counts lower, still beyond 45,000. Among the dead lay the consul Paulus, 29 military tribunes, and 80 men of senatorial rank, which means that in one afternoon Rome lost more than a quarter of its senate. Later, Roman writers claimed the gold rings of the fallen nobles were poured out on the floor of the Carthaginian senate in a heap. Whichever count you take, Cannae stands with the deadliest single days of battle in the ancient world, and armies would study it with awe ever after. So the war was over. Every rule of ancient warfare said so. Rome had lost an enormous share of its fighting men in 3 years. Its field armies were gone, its treasury drained, and now the defections finally began. Capua, the second city of Italy, whole regions of the south, eventually Syracuse in Sicily, most dangerous of all, King Philip V of Macedon, across the sea, allied himself with Hannibal against Rome. Hannibal's cavalry commander, Hannibal, in the most famous exchange Livy records, begged him to march on Rome at once, promising that within 5 days he would dine on the capital. Hannibal declined, judging that his exhausted army had no means to storm the largest fortified city in Italy. Hannibal's reply became immortal. "You know how to win a victory. Hannibal, you do not know how to use one." The line is unforgettable, and it points at the wrong mystery. The real question of Cannae is not why Hannibal failed to march. It is why Rome failed to surrender. Most ancient states, after Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, would at least have opened negotiations. That was how war worked. You demonstrated superiority. The loser paid and adjusted. Life continued. Hannibal's whole strategy rested on that logic. He was not trying to exterminate Rome. He was trying to break Rome's alliance system and force the city back down to a reasonable size. That is why he freed allied prisoners without ransom after every battle, advertising that his quarrel was with Rome, not with Italy. It was rational, proven statecraft, and it shattered against something the textbooks had no entry for. Rome refused to accept the verdict. The Senate refused to discuss peace. It thanked Varro, the surviving consul of the catastrophe, for not despairing of the Republic. It declined to ransom its own captured soldiers and armed slaves instead. It lowered the recruitment standards and raised new legions, and went back, grimly, to the strategy of Fabius, whose nickname, the Delenda, now became an honor, and the core of Rome's allies, the ones whose defection Hannibal's entire plan required, held. Here is the heart of this war. Cannae is remembered as the perfect battle, and it deserves the name, but its deepest lesson is about the limits of perfection. Hannibal played flawless chess against an opponent who responded by refusing to accept that the game was chess. Rome treated each annihilated army not as a verdict, but as an expense, against an enemy who will not accept defeat, who simply pays and continues. Even genius runs out of road. Hannibal remained in Italy for 13 more years. Rome never achieved the decisive battlefield destruction of his army that it wanted, and he marched at one point to the very walls of Rome, and it mattered less with every season, because the war was quietly moving to other tables. In Sicily, Rome ground down Syracuse in a siege made famous by the war machines of the mathematician Archimedes, who died in the sack. And in Spain, the silver engine of the Barca family was under attack by the army Rome had sent past Hannibal in the opposite direction. Back in the first autumn of the war, Spain is where the counterstroke was born. It was led by a young man whose father and uncle had both been killed there, fighting the Barcas. A man who had survived Cannae itself as a junior officer, and who had studied every one of Hannibal's battles the way a student studies a master. He drew the conclusion no other Roman dared draw. Stop trying to beat Hannibal in Italy. Take his empire away behind his back, and then make him fight in Africa, on Roman terms. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio. Carthage was about to meet its own reflection. Chapter 11. The Turning of the Tide. Rome did not choose Scipio the way republics are supposed to choose generals. In the year 210 BC, with both Roman commanders in Spain dead and the front collapsing, the assembly asked for volunteers to take the command. And, Livy says, the experienced men all found reasons to study their feet. Then a man in his middle 20s stepped forward, far too young for high command by law and custom, and offered himself. He was the son and nephew of the dead generals. The people, moved and somewhat desperate, voted him the province. Some in the Senate may have judged Spain a convenient place to dispose of an ambitious young man. Instead, Rome had just made one of the most consequential appointments in its history. Scipio arrived in Spain and did not do what grieving sons are expected to do. He did not hunt the armies that had killed his father. He studied the map the way a Barca would, and saw what everyone else had looked past. The 3 Carthaginian armies in Spain were dispersed, days apart from one another, and all of their money, their Spanish hostages, their stores and shipyards sat in one place, New Carthage, the Barcid capital, garrisoned by barely 1,000 men, because everyone knew it could not be reached before the field armies converged. In 209 BC, Scipio's force marched his army south and took the strongest city in Spain in a matter of days. He sent troops through a shallow lagoon on its landward side at a moment when the water level dropped. A passage the defenders barely watched because everyone knew the lagoon was impassable. Polybius, who later knew Scipio's family circle personally, reports that Scipio had questioned local fishermen about that lagoon in advance, and then told his soldiers the god Neptune had promised him a path through the water. Study the move, because every signature in it is Hannibalic. The quiet intelligence work beforehand, the attack from the direction certified as safe, even the theatre of the god's blessing. Morale, engineered as carefully as logistics. At Cannae, Rome had been given a lesson. Here was proof that one Roman had taken notes. What Scipio did next mattered even more. In New Carthage, he captured the hostages Carthage held to guarantee the loyalty of the Spanish tribes. Instead of keeping them as his own leverage, he sent them home to their families with gifts. Livy tells the famous story of a beautiful captive offered to the young general, who learned she was engaged, summoned her fiancé, and restored her to him untouched, adding her ransom money to her dowry. The stories grew in the telling, as stories around Scipio always did. But the policy underneath them was real, and it was surgical. Carthaginian rule in Spain ran on hostages and payment. Scipio was systematically buying the tribes with generosity, and the tribes began to come over. Hannibal had spent a decade trying to strip Rome of its allies, and mostly failing. Scipio stripped Carthage of Spain in 5 years. The military verdict came at Ilipa in 206 BC, and it deserves to be far more famous than it is. Facing a larger Carthaginian army, Scipio spent days deploying in the same formation each morning, his Roman veterans in the center, Spanish allies on the wings, letting the enemy commander memorize the pattern. Then one dawn he fed his men before first light, marched out early, and deployed reversed. Spaniards in the center, Romans on the wings, forcing battle on an enemy that had turned out unfed and arrayed against yesterday's army. The Roman wings crushed inward while the center held back, a kind of inverted Cannae. Carthaginian power in Spain died on that field, and the mines of Iberia, the silver that had financed everything from Hamilcar's crossing to Hannibal's elephants, now belonged to Rome. Empires of money die when the money moves. Scipio came home, won the consulship at an exceptionally young age, and proposed the strategy he had been building toward all along. The Agathocles play, Africa, and the Senate, led by the aged Fabius himself, fought him almost as hard as Carthage ever would. Some of it was prudence, the memory of Regulus's ruin. Some of it, Livy admits, was plain jealousy of a young man grown too bright. The compromise reached tells you everything about the politics. Scipio received Sicily as his province, permission to cross to Africa, and almost no regular army. His core troops would be the survivors of Cannae, men still serving out their disgrace in exile from Italy. Rome handed its best general, its most shamed soldiers, and half a blessing. Scipio took them gladly. No soldiers in the world had more to prove. He landed in Africa in 204 BC, and the war came home to Carthage after 60 years of being fought in other people's countries. The key to Africa was Numidian cavalry, the finest light horsemen alive, and the campaign turned on winning them. 2 rival Numidian kings framed the choice. Syphax, who had married a Carthaginian noblewoman and taken her city's side, and young Massinissa, dispossessed, brilliant, and burning to reclaim his kingdom, who brought his horsemen to Scipio. The decisive stroke came in the spring, and it is the stain on Scipio's African legend that even friendly sources cannot polish away. With peace talks as cover, his envoys studied the enemy winter camps, huts of wood and reed and thatch. Then, on a chosen night, Scipio's forces fired both camps at once. The sources describe soldiers cut down as they stumbled from the flames, believing the fire an accident. The allied armies of Africa effectively ceased to exist in a single night. Rome would talk about Punic treachery for the next 2,000 years. About this night, it talked considerably less. Carthage recalled its field armies, fought once more at the Great Plains, lost again, and then did the thing it had avoided for 15 years. It sent for Hannibal. The letter reached him in southern Italy, where he still stood with the remnant of the army that had crossed the Alps. Worn veterans now, far from home for half their lives. Livy depicts him raging at the summons, cursing not Rome but the politicians of Carthage, who in his telling had never sent the reinforcement the Italian campaign needed. The reality was more tangled. Carthage was fighting on many fronts at once. In Spain, in Sicily, in Sardinia, and at sea, and it did send Hannibal support at times, including a brother who marched a second army over the Alps and lost it, and his life, before he could join him, wherever the blame belongs. The outcome was the same. In 203 BC, Hannibal sailed from Italy. He had entered it at 29. He was leaving in his middle 40s, going home, for the first time since the age of 9, to defend a city he barely knew from an enemy he had taught. The armies met near Zama, southwest of Carthage, in 202 BC. Before the battle, both Polybius and Livy record an extraordinary scene. Hannibal asked for a meeting, and the two greatest commanders of the age rode out between the armies with only interpreters. Polybius reports the encounter as fact, though the speeches he gives them should be read as literary reconstruction, the ancient historian's way of dramatizing what the moment meant in that reconstruction. Hannibal, the older man, speaks of fortune's wheel, of how he himself once stood at the gates of Rome and now stands asking terms at the gates of Carthage, and he offers peace. Take the shore settlement, he says, over the uncertain battle. Scipio's answer is courteous and iron. Rome did not start this war. The time for terms has passed. Submit or fight. They parted, in Polybius' phrase, in mutual admiration and without agreement, the master and the student, each the only man alive who fully understood the other, and neither with anything left to say. The battle the next day was the whole war in miniature. Hannibal, short of the one weapon he had ridden to every victory, cavalry, tried craft to the last. He opened with a charge of reportedly 80 elephants, which Scipio defeated with prepared corridors through his ranks, trumpet blasts, and open lanes that let the beasts run harmlessly through, some turning back into the Carthaginian lines. The infantry fight was long, grinding, and closer than the legend admits. Hannibal's Italian veterans standing like a wall in the third line. What decided it was Hannibal's own signature, turned against him. The Roman and Numidian cavalry broke their Carthaginian counterparts, chased them from the field, and then, at the killing moment, returned to strike the rear of Hannibal's line. Cannae, executed against its inventor. Polybius puts the Carthaginian dead at 20,000, against a fraction of that among the Romans. Hannibal escaped the field, rode into Carthage, and told the Senate, with a professional's flat honesty, that the war was lost and peace was the only strategy left. The terms of 201 BC ended Carthage as a great power. The fleet, the pride of centuries, was surrendered and burned within sight of the city, and the sources say the people mourned the flames as if Carthage itself were burning. The overseas empire was gone. An indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver would flow to Rome over 50 years, a leash designed to last 2 generations. Carthage would keep a token handful of warships, and it could wage no war, anywhere, ever again, without Roman permission. On the border, Rome recognized and strengthened the Numidian kingdom of Massinissa, now enlarged, armed, and pointedly free to test its weakened neighbor. Rome had won everything. And inside that clause about permission, and inside that ambitious king on the frontier, the final destruction of Carthage was already taking shape. Half a century early, what no one in Rome expected was what the disarmed city would do next. Carthage, stripped of empire, army, and navy, was about to grow rich again. It turned out that this was the one thing Rome could not forgive. Chapter 12. Carthago Delenda est. The last 50 years of Carthage form one of the strangest and saddest stories in ancient history. It is the story of a city recovering under restrictions designed to keep it weak, and discovering that the recovery itself would be treated as a threat. Start with the man Rome hated most. In the years after Zama, Hannibal did not retire into bitterness. Around 196 BC, the people of Carthage elected him Suffet, chief magistrate, and the greatest general of the age revealed a final talent no one had suspected. He was a gifted civilian reformer. Livy tells us he audited the state's finances and found what defeated states usually contain: a self-dealing elite. The powerful court of judges had hardened into a club of lifetime appointments, and public revenue was leaking into private pockets, while ordinary citizens carried the burden of the Roman indemnity. Hannibal broke the club, made the judgeships annual and elected, and recovered enough stolen revenue that Carthage was soon able to offer early payment on a war debt meant to last 50 years. The full recovery had many causes and took decades, and Hannibal did not stay to see it. But the picture the sources leave is remarkable enough on its own. The man Rome called faithless spent his last months in office fighting corruption, and the city he served was shortly able to embarrass its creditor by paying too fast. The oligarchs he had exposed took revenge in the classic way. They wrote to Rome, whispering that Hannibal was conspiring with Rome's great eastern rival, King Antiochus of Syria. In 195 BC, a Roman commission sailed for Carthage, and Hannibal, understanding what such commissions concluded, slipped out of the city by night, rode to the coast, and sailed east into exile. He never saw Carthage again. And in fairness to Rome's fears, the exile did go to Antiochus, and did advise him in his war with Rome. The old man kept his oath to the end, but Rome's pursuit of him outlasted any army he ever advised. Agents tracked him from court to court across the eastern Mediterranean for over a decade, until around 183 BC, cornered at last in Bithynia. In modern Turkey, he took the poison he had long carried, reportedly in a ring. The tradition preserves last words that read as a verdict on his pursuers. Let us relieve the Romans of their long anxiety. He is reported to have said, since they find it tedious to wait for an old man's death. He was in his 60s. The boy from the altar had kept his oath for a lifetime, and it is worth recording that his great opponent, Scipio, died in the same period, in a kind of internal exile of his own, driven from public life by political enemies who put the hero of Zama on trial. Rome was not always kinder to its own great men than to its enemies. Meanwhile, the disarmed city bloomed, freed from the costs of empire, no fleets to maintain, no mercenary armies to pay. Carthage poured its energy into the channels left open: commerce and agriculture. The farms of the African hinterland, worked by the methods in Mago's manual, became the garden of the Western Mediterranean. Archaeology confirms a building boom in these very decades, new residential quarters rising, and, remarkably, the great circular harbour rebuilt in splendid form. Within a generation of total defeat, Carthage was again one of the most prosperous cities in the ancient world. And here this story reaches its coldest lesson. Wealth without power does not buy safety. It buys attention. The attention had a name: Marcus Porcius Cato, called Cato the Censor, a veteran of the war against Hannibal, and, in his old age, the most persistent public voice for the destruction of Carthage. In 153 BC, the elderly Cato visited Carthage on a diplomatic mission and came home alarmed. Plutarch tells us, not by Carthaginian arms, which barely existed, but by Carthaginian prosperity. The crowded harbour, the bursting warehouses. From then on, the tradition records, Cato ended every speech he gave in the Senate, on any subject whatever, with the same sentence. Furthermore, I judge that Carthage must be destroyed. Carthago delenda est. Plutarch adds the theatrical detail that Cato once shook out the fold of his toga on the Senate floor and let fall fresh African figs, huge and gleaming, telling the senators that the land which grew them lay 3 days' sail from Rome. Historians debate the exact wording of the famous slogan, which reaches us second-hand. And Cato was not the only Roman pressing for war, but the campaign itself is not in doubt. Year after year, one sentence, repeated until a monstrous idea came to sound like a policy option. It is worth asking, whenever you hear a phrase hammered into normality by repetition, what the repetition is for. Rome's instrument was already in position. Masinissa, now an old and powerful king, had spent decades expanding at Carthage's expense, seizing disputed territory piece by piece. Each time, Carthage did the only thing the treaty allowed. It appealed to Rome. Each time, Roman commissioners ruled for Masinissa, or ruled nothing at all, which served the same purpose. The treaty had made Rome the judge in every Carthaginian dispute, and the arrangement gave Rome every incentive to let Carthaginian patience run out. For half a century, Carthage held to the terms while its territory shrank. Then, around 151 BC, the last installment of the indemnity was paid, and some in Carthage argued that the treaty's restrictions had died with the debt. When Masinissa's next aggression came, Carthage finally raised an army and fought back. It lost the battle, and it had committed, in Roman eyes, the precise crime the treaty existed to define. War without permission. Rome began mobilizing, and in 149 BC, declared it. What happened before the first blow fell is one of the cruelest diplomatic sequences in ancient history, and I want you to watch each step of it. Carthage, desperate to avoid war, condemned its own generals and sent envoys offering complete submission. Rome answered that Carthage could keep its freedom, laws, and land if it first handed over 300 children of its noblest families as hostages. Weeping, the account in Polybius's tradition tells us. The families gave up their children. Then the consuls, already landed in Africa with an enormous army, announced a further requirement. Carthage must surrender its weapons. The city complied. The sources describe the wagon trains rolling out, hundreds of thousands of sets of arms, and around 2,000 catapults. The entire defense of a great city, handed over on the strength of a promise. And then, with Carthage stripped of its noble children and its weapons, the consuls revealed the final condition. The people of Carthage were free to live and to take their belongings, but the city of Carthage would be demolished, and its people must resettle at least 10 miles from the sea. For a nation of sailors and traders, that was not relocation. It was execution by other means. Each demand had been sequenced so that refusal only became possible after resistance had become hopeless. Polybius lays out the steps without flinching. Remember, he was Rome's admirer, Rome's guest, and Rome's witness. Carthage refused anyway. The city that had surrendered its children and its weapons closed its gates. What happened inside them is one of the great desperate mobilizations of history. The sources describe public buildings and temples converted into workshops running day and night, turning out shields, swords, spears, and catapults. The women of Carthage. The tradition in Appian records cut off their hair to be twisted into cords for the catapult springs. Because a blockaded city had no other fiber strong enough, slaves were freed and armed. A city with no army held off the greatest power on earth, not for weeks, but for 3 years. The Roman siege, begun with overwhelming force against a disarmed town, bogged down in failure and disease, until Rome, in frustration, handed the command to a young officer who had distinguished himself in the fighting. His name was Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the Scipio who had won at Zama. His close companion and former tutor was a Greek historian named Polybius. That is why our best account of the death of Carthage is an eyewitness account. Polybius stood beside the commanding general and watched. Scipio Aemilianus sealed the city with a wall across the isthmus, then strangled the harbour with a great stone mole, cutting off the last trickle of supply. Famine did its slow work through the winter. In the spring of 146 BC, the legions broke into the harbour district, and then into the city. And the final act was 6 days and nights of fighting. Street by street, house by house. The descriptions in Appian, drawing on the lost account of Polybius, are among the most terrible pages left to us from the ancient world. The tall houses you heard about in chapter 3 became fortresses, and the Romans took them roof by roof, laying planks between buildings and fighting across them while the streets below burned. Behind the assault troops came demolition teams and fire, and I will summarize the rest rather than describe it. The city was leveled as it was taken. Of a population, the ancients numbered in the hundreds of thousands at the siege's start. The survivors who came out at the end numbered around 50,000. They were sold into slavery. The Carthaginian commander, Hasdrubal, left his last stronghold and begged for his life at Scipio's feet. His wife, the tradition in Appian records, watched him do it from the burning temple where the last defenders stood, cursed him for his cowardice, and threw herself and her children into the flames. 9 chapters ago, you heard the legend of Elissa's pyre at the founding, whether by history or by the way ancient writers shaped memory into story. Carthage was made to end in the same image of fire with which its legend began. Either way, the image has never left the human imagination. As the city burned, Polybius records a moment that has echoed for 2,000 years. Scipio Aemilianus, watching the destruction he commanded, wept and quoted Homer, the lines on the fall of Troy. A day will come when sacred Ilium shall perish. Polybius asked him what he meant, and Scipio answered that he was thinking of his own country, and of the day when the same fate would fall upon Rome. To me, that is the most honest sentence to survive from any Roman on the subject of empire. But judge it for yourself. The conqueror, at the summit of victory, mourning his own city's future in the flames of his victim. The Senate's commissioners finished what the fires began. The walls were leveled. According to later tradition, the site itself was placed under a ritual curse. Carthage ceased to exist as an independent state, and the Punic city vanished from the political map. Its territory reorganized as the Roman province of Africa. Much of Carthage's written world was scattered, burned, or lost in the years that followed. And of all that learning, Roman authorities ordered one work preserved and translated for their own use: Mago's Manual on Farming, while other Punic books, the tradition says, were handed to African rulers in that same year, 146 BC. Roman armies also destroyed Corinth, the great commercial city of Greece. Within a single year, the Mediterranean had become a Roman lake, and that, for 2,000 years, was supposed to be the end. It was not quite the end. Chapter 13. The City That Would Not Die. Let us begin the last chapter by testing the most famous fact about Carthage. You have probably heard that after the destruction, the Romans sowed the ground with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. It is in textbooks, in novels, in 1,000 comment sections. Here is the problem. No ancient source says it. Not Polybius. Not Appian. Not the Livian tradition. None of them. Scholars who traced the story found it taking root only in modern books, with one influential early appearance in a respected academic history published in 1930, from which it spread outward into general knowledge. Salt was valuable. The land of Africa was the prize. Within a century, the fields around the dead city were helping to feed Rome itself. The salting is a legend, and that discovery is the perfect final lesson of this story. Even the destruction of Carthage was mythologized, and the myth outran the record. If a detail that wrong can ride repetition into your textbook, it is worth asking what else arrived by the same road. Now watch what actually grew in the cursed ground. Within a generation, Roman politicians were eyeing the best harbour site in Africa. The reformer Gaius Gracchus tried to plant a colony there, and the project was strangled in the politics that soon killed him. With the curse on the site invoked against it, Julius Caesar revived the idea. The Emperor Augustus carried it out, refounding the city as a Roman colony. And here is the twist of twists. Roman Carthage boomed, built on the same hill, around the same harbours, fed by the same African wheat. It grew into one of the greatest cities of the Roman Empire, among the largest in the West, after Rome itself, with baths, theatres, and a vast amphitheatre. Rome spent 3 wars and a curse erasing this location, and then rebuilt it, because the geography that had made Carthage never stopped being true. The narrow waste of the sea, the sheltered anchorages, the fertile plain. Cities are arguments made by geography, and Rome could burn the arguers, but not the argument. The people proved as durable as the place. Punic, the language of Carthage, did not die in 146 BC. It survived in the towns and countryside of North Africa for centuries after the destruction. Saint Augustine, the great Christian thinker, born in Roman North Africa around 5 centuries after the fall, mentions Punic speakers in his own writings, and inscriptions carry the language deep into the Roman era. Farmers went on working the land by methods Mago would have recognized. Old gods lived on under Roman names. Baal Hammon, continuing his long career as the African Saturn. Rome had destroyed a state in a season. A culture, it turned out, could not be demolished by commission. Even Hannibal refused to stay buried. Roman parents frightened children with his name for centuries. Hannibal at the gates. Roman military writers studied his battles with the obsession of survivors, and the afterlife never stopped. Cannae, the perfect encirclement, entered the permanent curriculum of war. It has been taught in modern military academies on multiple continents, and a famous German strategist wrote an entire study of envelopment under that very name at the start of the 20th century, treating a battle from 2,000 years earlier as a live template. Very few human beings have thrown a longer shadow with one day's work, and the city itself came back into the light in the end. Not by sword but by trowel. From the 19th century onward, and above all in a great international campaign coordinated through UNESCO beginning in the 1970s. Archaeologists recovered what the fires and the Roman rebuilders had buried. They mapped the circular war harbour and found traces of the ship sheds where the old descriptions placed them. They uncovered a residential quarter on Bursa Hill. Streets and houses sealed under the destruction layer of 146 BC. The burn lines still visible in the soil. They raised the bronze rams of warships from the seabed off Sicily. From the very battle that ended the First War with Rome, they excavated the Tophet and reopened, honestly and painfully, the hardest question in Carthaginian history, piece by piece. The killed city has been allowed to give evidence at last. And the evidence does something more interesting than take sides. Sometimes it confirms the ancient writers, the harbour's shape, the tall houses, the wealth. Sometimes it complicates them. And sometimes, as at the Tophet, it forces us to sit with possibilities we might prefer to assign to propaganda. The site of Carthage is today a World Heritage location, and the modern nation around it, Tunisia, keeps the memory with pride, in its museums, on its currency, in the name of an international airport. The city Rome sentenced to non-existence has outlived the sentence. It has outlived Rome. So let us stand one last time on Bursa Hill, where we began, and ask what this story was actually about. Not elephants. In the end, not even war. It was about who gets to tell the story afterward. For most of 2,000 years, the world knew Carthage almost entirely through the voices of its rivals and its conquerors. And through them, we inherited a caricature. The cruel, faithless, money-loving merchant city that deserved its fire. The evidence you have seen across these 13 chapters tells a more complicated and more human story. A republic that Aristotle thought worth studying. Sailors who pushed into the Atlantic when the Atlantic was the edge of the world. An alphabet's children. A farming science so valuable that the conquerors saved it from their own fire. A general whose worst enemies could not stop praising him. A disarmed city whose women gave their hair for catapult cord in its last winter. And darkrooms too. The Tophet urns. The squeezed Libyan subjects whose fury nearly destroyed the city from within. The mercenary cruelties. Carthage was an ancient empire among ancient empires, with an empire's sins. And it does not need to be innocent to deserve a fair hearing. The point was never that Carthage was wronged and Rome was wicked. Rome, remember, produced the very historians who preserved Carthaginian greatness, and a general who wept at his own victory. The point is simpler, and it outlasts them both. Carthage was silenced, and a silenced people cannot answer even the charges that are false. When Scipio stood in the flames and saw Rome's own ending in them, he understood something his Senate did not. Every empire is a future ruin. Every victor's history is a rough draft awaiting correction. Rome fell in its turn, and other empires after it. And the correction of Carthage's story is still going on right now, in excavation reports and laboratories and, in its small way, in videos like this one. Perhaps that is the final legacy of the city Rome was afraid of. Not the wars, not even Hannibal's long shadow. A warning, delivered across 22 centuries in the smell of smoke. Be careful whose story you accept without asking who wrote it, and why. The truth, like the city, can be buried for a very long time, but it does not stay buried